Hello, today we'll be discussing entrepreneurial ecosystems and we'll be doing this in under 15 minutes. So, what are entrepreneurial ecosystems? They are very similar to an ecological ecosystem, just in the same way that an ecological system needs water, sunlight, or soil. Entrepreneurial ecosystems need capital, customer interest, talent, innovation, and so forth. Entrepreneurial ecosystems are the formal and informal collaboration between actors, organizations, institutions, and processes to govern and mediate a local entrepreneurial environment. By formal and informal collaboration, Mason and Brown meant that formal was something that was pre-arranged, it was formally agreed upon, so something like meetings or business emails, whereas contrastingly, informal was something which just occurred fluidly. It was an informal meeting in a coffee shop, a passing in an elevator, and any collaboration which occurs in these types of formats. Now, this could occur between the actors, and the actors could be both existing, so those which currently exist within the ecosystem, or future. So if I moved to Silicon Valley, I could be a future actor. I would be an entrepreneur which has not yet started my entrepreneurial venture, but I am planning to do so, and in the future I will become an entrepreneurial actor. And thus I can still formally and informally collaborate with existing actors in the environment. There are also organizations which include, but are not limited to, venture capitalists, business networking organizations, and business incubators. There are also institutions, and these help create the rules of the game within the local environment, and these could be universities, financial bodies, intellectual property laws, or countless others. And lastly, we have got processes. And by processes, I'm referring to the number of serial entrepreneurs, high growth firms, and the levels of blockbuster entrepreneurship. Serial entrepreneurs refers to those individuals which consistently launch new entrepreneurial ventures. Number of high growth firms considers the number of firms which are growing at an extremely rapid rate within a geographically proximate environment. And the levels of blockbuster entrepreneurship involves those businesses which have reached valuations of above $1 billion. That is what constitutes a blockbuster entrepreneur. And if you've got several of those within a specific geographic area, then it's a strong indication that an entrepreneurial ecosystem is in existence. And it's the same with serial entrepreneurs and high growth firms. If there are a high number of high growth firms within the ecosystem, then it is highly likely that that is an entrepreneurial ecosystem, as with the serial entrepreneurs. The most common method used to understand and visualize entrepreneurial ecosystems is Eisenberg's 6 domains model. This posits that policy, finance, culture, support, human capital, and markets all play a part in defining the nature and the style of entrepreneurship within an ecosystem. This framework will be applied in just a minute to Cambridge in the UK to understand the nature of their entrepreneurial ecosystem. So now we're going to discuss very briefly two real-world ecosystems. On the left, we've got Cambridge, which is also known as the Cambridge Cluster or Silicon Fen. And then on the right, we have got Silicon Valley, which is in California. So as you can see, both ecosystems possess elements of Mason and Brown's initial definition, such as networking organizations, business incubators, and angel investors. These two are arguably the most successful entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world, and I highly recommend that outside of this video you go on to study these further. But within the video we will be discussing Cambridge, and we'll be doing this by applying it to Isenberg's 6 domains model. Now I'm going to demonstrate Eisenberg's 6 domains model once it's applied to Cambridge's Silicon Fen. As you can see on the screen in front of you, each domain has been contextualized to the local Cambridge Silicon Fen environment. For instance, under the support professions, you've got local Cambridge accountants, consultants, and lawyers. Under the success stories, You have got different local successes like the human genome discovery or Bluetooth. Under leadership, you've got the local leadership qualities and so forth. Now, the importance of Eisenberg's 6 domains model is that it demonstrates the nature of the entrepreneurial ecosystem and how it came about. For example, you can see that under the human capital domain, Cambridge has got a world-leading university. This world-leading university actually specialises in biology and technology, and subsequently the success stories within Cambridge, if you look under the culture domain, are representative of this, with the human genome discovery and the identification of the DNA molecule, all the way through to the ARM processor, artificial intelligence, and IVF treatment. The very nature of the entrepreneurial ecosystem is that it is founded upon those firms and those actors and those organizations which compose the ecosystem. And as you can see, that is why Cambridge's research institutes include the Centre for Science and Policy and the Computer Aided Design Centre, because the ecosystem specializes in science and technology. And Eisenberg's 6 domains model is very useful in this context because it allows us to clearly visualize and articulate why the ecosystem exists, where its strengths are, and the most important components which it is composed of. So, some common assumptions and theories about entrepreneurial ecosystems. It is first worth pointing out that entrepreneurial ecosystems do not require the particular presence of any specific characteristics. So, for example, Cambridge Silicon Fen is the UK's best entrepreneurial ecosystem, but up until the 1980s, there were no angel investors, there were no venture capitalists, no business incubators, no nothing. It was the university, the government, and a couple of small businesses. This completely disagrees with Mason and Brown's original definition, which says that certain organizations and actors and blah 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 are needed, because they aren't necessarily needed. It is more about the success that small entrepreneurial ventures have, and that's going to lead on well to my next point, which is Isenberg's law of small numbers. So Eisenberg posits that only a small handful of entrepreneurial successes are needed for major ecosystem benefits in terms of spillover effects. For instance, if we compare an entrepreneurial ecosystem to an ecological ecosystem, when a whale dies, several thousand microorganisms and fish and sharks swarming around the whale to eat its blood and its guts, and because the whale has died, there's now a whole ecosystem around it, which is self-sustaining, and eventually it will just become its own thing. It is the exact same with an entrepreneurial ecosystem. Just as I said in Cambridge, up until the 1980s, there were no organizations. There was one guy, and there was David. He's called David Cleary. He created one very, very successful entrepreneurial venture, and if you want to find out what it is, you can do your own research on it. It's amazing how he did it. But it's also Robert Noyce in Silicon Valley. These guys created small businesses which grew to such a size that they built out so much knowledge and resources and capital and talent that a whole ecosystem flooded up around it. Robert Noyce's, for instance, his Fairchild Semiconductor led to becoming one of the largest technology companies in all of the US. Inside of this technology company, there were very, very intelligent people who left and created spin-offs. These spin-off organizations took inspiration from Robert Noyce, who was a role model. They also then left their second businesses, like Robert Noyce did, and formed another business and another business. They became serial entrepreneurs. And then upon finishing their serial entrepreneurship, they offered capital to new investors, so they became angel investors, and so on and so forth. All because Robert Noyce decided to start that Fairchild Semiconductor. There was a whole ecosystem that formed around him. And lastly, there are spin-offs. So spin-offs are new ventures formed by former employees from large organizations. And these are the most common symbolizations of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. If you have got spin-offs occurring, then it's very likely that there are high levels of entrepreneurship within a specific region. Moving forward,
So these are the
three common assumptions and theories
within literature
surrounding entrepreneurial
and it's just something to
ecosystems.
bear in mind when you are considering.
There is a common assumption that entrepreneurial ecosystems do not require the particular presence of any specific characteristics. For example, Silicon Valley in Cambridge emerged during the 1960s,
three assumptions in mind,
during which time
trying
there
to
were no
understand the
angel
nature
investors,
of
venture
the entrepreneurial
capitalists,
ecosystem and how it
business
came to be.
incubators, or any other organisations which were mentioned by Mason and Brown in their definition. And this carried on up until the 1980s. Evidently, the flourishment of the ecosystem, in spite of these organisations being absent, suggests that no specific characteristic is needed, and that an ecosystem can flourish even without these. Secondly, Eisenberg's law of small numbers posits that only a handful of entrepreneurial successes are needed for major spillover effects. For example, entrepreneur Robert Noyce in Silicon Valley created Fairchild Semiconductor, which in turn shared knowledge with other semiconductor firms, acted as a role model for new startups, and offered financial support. Showing how just one small entrepreneurial success, which was Robert Noyce and his Fairchild Semiconductor, had massive spillover effects within the rest of Silicon Valley. And lastly, spin-offs. Spin-offs consider the new ventures which are formed by former employees, typically those from large organizations. Referring back to Robert Noyce and Fairchild Semiconductor, the company Fairchild Semiconductor was actually a spin-off of another company, and Fairchild itself actually spun off several new businesses, including angel investors. They spun off networking groups. They spun off Silicon Valley's first venture capitalist. I think they're called Silicon Valley Ventures, and several other new businesses, including other semiconductor firms, all spun out of Fairchild Semiconductor. Moving forward, So in summary, entrepreneurial ecosystems are comparable to biological ecosystems. Entrepreneurial ecosystems involve the collaboration of actors, organizations, institutions, and processes within a specific geographic environment. For example, Silicon Valley in California or Silicon Fen in the UK in Cambridge. And lastly, startups benefit from several aspects of entrepreneurial ecosystems, particularly due to the presence of Florida's creative class. Here are some of the references which I've used. I highly recommend you revise over them because they are incredibly useful for understanding ecosystems and entrepreneurial systems. And on the next video, we'll be discussing TSIS dynamic capabilities. Thanks for watching.